Nobody's ever found a single gene that determines any mental health condition. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that determine any mental health condition. Nobody has ever found a group of genes that if you don't have them, you will not have a certain mental health conditions. There are a large group of genes that the more of them you have, the more you risk and more at risk you are for any number of mental health conditions, but no specific ones, which means that the genes cannot cause the disease, because if they did, when they showed up, so should the disease in every case, but it doesn't. And you can have the same disease, or if you want to call it that, but even without the genes. Because the fact is, scientifically speaking, that genes are turned on and off by the environment. So it's a question of what kind of environment is acting on certain genes that'll promote one kind of development or a less healthy kind of development. And that again comes back to the social context. It's in the social context, in our set of relationships with our parents, beginning in utero, where the emotional stresses on the mother will already have an impact on the developing brain of the child and the physiology of the child, the birth process, the birthing process, the child-rearing environment. These are the conditions under which we develop in healthy ways or we don't. And my argument is that in this culture, it's increasingly a toxic environment that distorts human development. So if you want to understand why more and more kids are being diagnosed with everything under the sun and being medicated for it, for that matter, or if you want to understand why there's a inexplicable rising tide of childhood suicides in the United States, about which there's a lot of hand-wringing, but very little insight. If you want to understand the New York Times article that 6 weeks ago revealed that this one teenager who's on 10 different psychiatric medications, 10 different, they should maybe be on one, if at all. 10 different psychiatric medications. Well, what accounts for the rising tide of addictions or autoimmune disease? Either you assume that these are all genetic conditions, which, by the way, even on the face of it cannot be true, because genes don't change in a population over 10, 15, 20, 30, or 100 years. So if something is rising, whatever's doing it, it cannot be genetic. And if since the numbers of these conditions is rising and the number of people being affected by it is rising, then just as in a laboratory, if you're growing organism in a lab culture, and many of them got ill, you'd have to say this is a toxic culture. There's something about this culture that's making the creatures that live in it sick. I'm making the same argument about the culture that we're living in today. So, given the mind-body unity, we just have to look at people's emotional lives, not as the only cause of an illness, but as a significant contributing factor. And the reason it's important to look at that, because that's one of the factors that we can change. Just like we can change somebody's diet for the healthier, just as we can suggest that people change their relationship to their bodies in terms of exercise and rest and sleep and getting fresh air and all that, we can also address this significant contribution to disease that Soma Weiss pointed out is at least as important as physical factors in the causation of illness, and should be at least as important in the treatment. Now, what is the essential psychological factor that I have found, at least, and not just me, by the way, contributes to the onset of illness? What it is separation from ourselves, a disconnection from ourselves. And what I'm talking about here is about trauma, because the impact of trauma is to disconnect us from ourselves. And that's adaptive. That's actually adaptive. If conditions are such that the child is suffering in a way that's not being helped or alleviated by nurturing adults, and the child is alone with the suffering, it's unbearable. So you disconnect from your body, and you disconnect from your emotions. And that disconnection is the essence of trauma. That disconnection has then physiological consequences and mental consequences. Take a condition like depression, for example, said to be this genetic biological brain disease. Is it? Well, biology is certainly involved, because we know, as I've experienced personally, that if you're very depressed and if you take antidepressant medication, changing the biology of your brain, that can actually make you feel better. So that's true. There's some biology involved here. But we can't jump from that fact to assuming that biology is the cause of it, because it turns out that human biology is very much under the impact of the environment, including the emotional environment. In fact, the brain itself develops an interaction with the emotional environment. So I'm not going to find the citation now, but I can quote a Harvard paper that came out in 2012, that point, and it was published in a major medical journal. This article from Harvard said that the human brain develops with a complex process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood. And the most significant factor in shaping the development of the human brain is the quality of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early years. In other words, the biology of the brain itself is significantly determined by the emotional environment acting on the genes. It's not genes or the environment, it's the environment acting on the genes. And the most significant aspect is the emotional relationship with the nurturing adults. And that's where this culture begins its toxic imprint on the human child and the traumatization of the human child. A trauma, to be clear, it's a word that we use rather loosely and promiscuously. On the other hand, we don't use it nearly often enough. So we use it rather too loosely when we talk about difficult experiences being traumatic. You know, I saw this movie last night and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You just were upset, or you had some sad feelings, or you had some emotional pain. That's not the same as trauma. So as Peter Levine, the trauma psychologist, points out, all trauma is stressful, but not every stress is traumatic. When is it traumatic? It's traumatic when it wounds us in a wound that lasts. Because the origin of the word trauma is actually wound. It's a Greek word for wounding. And so it's a psychological wound. Now, what's the nature of a wound? A wound is, if it's open and raw, it's very sensitive. So if I pat myself on the shoulder here right now, there's no pain whatsoever. But you can imagine if I had a burn, for example, on my shoulder, and I wasn't wearing any protective clothing, and the nerve endings were close to the surface, for which, by the way, we have an expression in English, it's called being thin-skinned, and we tend to sort of look upon people who are thin-skinned. You know how those people are? They're just more sensitive. That's what they inherited genetically. Not any disease, but a sensitivity, which means that when you tap them even lightly, they hurt a lot more. It also means that with the same genes, if they're treated well, they just become that much more creative, spontaneous, intuitive, and lively than others. The sensitivity doesn't determine illness. It determines your sensitivity to the environment. What happens to you then and how you develop depends on what the environment does to you, what environment you grow up in.